On January 27, 2025, the 81st anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, several of the last living voices of the Holocaust raised their arms once again before cameras and parliaments. In that wrinkled skin, numbers tattooed in 1944 and 1945 are still visible, when they were children of 3, 5 or 7 years old in a system that murdered more than 1.5 million Jewish minors. What we now see as institutional memory began in cattle cars, in ghettos crowded with thousands of people, and in barracks where silence was a survival strategy. Tova Friedman survived the Kinderlager of Auschwitz, and on October 7, 1944, she was inside a gas chamber from which she emerged alive. That same system dragged Sam Harris to the deportation line to Treblinka, from which he escaped when his father, in a desperate gesture, pushed him out at just 7 years old. Months later, as the Reich collapsed, Eva Clarke was born on April 29, 1945, on a cart at the gates of Mauthausen, just 6 days before her liberation. This documentary does not only look back, it follows the path by which those children, marked for disappearance, turned their survival into a duty of memory before the world. Stolen Childhood in Auschwitz, Tova Friedman, From Silent Child to Global Voice. When we see today a woman over 80 holding a mobile phone in front of her grandson and speaking to millions of young people on TikTok, it's easy to forget that this same woman was once just a number freshly tattooed on the arm of a 5-year-old girl. Tova Friedman's story begins long before viral videos, in a time and place where Jewish childhood in Eastern Europe became a brutal experiment in destruction. Tova was born in 1938 in Gdynia, a Polish port near Gdańsk. Her parents, Rizel and Mashel, had left behind the small town of Tomaszow Mazowiecki in search of better opportunities, but when the war broke out, the family made the reverse journey and returned to their hometown. There they would encounter the concrete form that persecution would take, an improvised ghetto in 6 4-story buildings, crowded with about 5,000 Jews, including thousands of children. For Tova, that space would be the first world she would remember. Crowded staircases, queues for a piece of food, sporadic gunshots, rumors of deportations that the adults tried to hide from the youngest. The population of the ghetto shrinks as the years of occupation progress. Hunger is not an abstraction. It is the body of a child who becomes accustomed to feeling weak, to seeing neighbors and family disappear. Executions in the streets, night raids, and the first deportations to unknown camps begin emptying the houses. For Tova, the war is not a map of fronts but the succession of absences. Later, her family will be sent to the Starachowicz labor camp complex, where her parents work in a munitions factory. The child learns very quickly that her survival depends on the ability of the adults to remain useful to the Germans. When the Nazis decide to deport the children from the area, Tova's father asks her to hide in a small gap above the roof of their house. It is a typical scene from many Holocaust stories. An adult who knows too much tries, with a minimal gesture, to outsmart the machinery of extermination. For a while, that hiding place works, but the protection doesn't last. In 1944, her father is deported to Dachau, and Tova, along with her mother, is sent on a cattle train to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She is 5 years old. When the train doors open, language is reduced to shouted orders, barking dogs, and the constant smoke of the crematoriums. Unlike most children, Tova is not killed upon arrival. It is a detail that will mark her life forever. She belongs to the small group of minors selected to live, at least temporarily. They shave her, take off her clothes, and tattoo a number on her arm. That number erases her name, but paradoxically, it also ensures a form of memory. Decades later, this number will be the material proof of her story before the cameras. In 1944, however, it only means that she has entered the camp's machinery as a numbered prisoner, confined to the Kinderlager, the children's camp within Auschwitz. There, childhood is redefined as daily survival, enduring hunger, cold, violence, and epidemics, learning not to attract attention. Tova will always remember that at 5 years old, she could no longer conceive of a world outside of Auschwitz. She didn't know that normal cities, schools, or parks existed. Her universe was the mud of the barracks, the screams in German, the lit chimneys. From a historical perspective, this shows the level of uprooting the Nazi system imposed. It didn't just kill bodies, it also confined the mental horizons of the youngest survivors to the physical limits of the camp. The child internalizes an absurd logic. The day you're not chosen for anything, the day you go unnoticed, is a day one. The most extreme episode that will mark her memory occurs on October 7, 1944. That day, Tova and other children are taken to the gas chamber. Years later, historians will link that date to the Sonderkommando revolt in Auschwitz, when prisoners working in the crematoriums blew up part of the facility. For a 5-year-old girl, all that remains is the feeling of having been inside a place of death, from which, due to some technical failure and the desperate actions of other prisoners, she emerged alive. She is one of the very few people who can say they were inside an Auschwitz gas chamber and survived. That fact, uniquely biographical, will later make her a particularly relevant witness. The winter of 1944-45 brings with it the collapse of the Third Reich. As the Red Army approaches, the Nazis attempt to erase the evidence of their crimes. They destroy documents, blow up crematoriums, and organize death marches to evacuate prisoners to the interior of the Reich. In January 1945, Tova and her mother should have been part of one of those doomed columns, walking for kilometers in the snow, without food, with those who fell being executed at the roadside. Instead, the two of them hide in the infirmary among the corpses, pretending to be dead. The extreme camouflage, using the presence of other bodies as a shield. When the Germans abandon the camp, they remain there, motionless, until Soviet soldiers enter Auschwitz on January 27th. The image of Tova, a very thin girl raising her tattooed arm for a Soviet photographer's camera, will become one of the iconic photographs of the liberation. The liberation, however, is not the end of the traumatic story, but the beginning of a new stage, marked by illness and uprooting. Tova and her mother pass through hospitals, sanatoriums for tuberculosis patients, and displaced persons camps. They return to Tomaszow Mazowiecki and discover that the family home has been destroyed and that almost all of their extended family has been killed. In that city, where around 5,000 Jewish children once lived, only 5 remain alive. Tova is one of them. It is a cold, statistical fact, but also a key to understanding the moral burden she will feel throughout her life. Every day of her adult life is lived under the awareness of having survived when almost no other child from the same place did. The return of her father from Dachau sometime later allows for the reconstruction of a minimal family nucleus. They spend some years in Poland, in a country now communist and hostile to many forms of Jewish life. Like so many other families, they decide to emigrate. In 1950, when Tova is 12 years old, the family embarks on a journey to the United States and settles in Brooklyn. The Auschwitz child becomes a teenager in New York, facing the clash of languages, customs, and expectations. At school, the war exists in textbooks. For her, it still smells of smoke and disinfectant. The tattoos on her arm, which in Poland were a shared mark among survivors, in America are a rarity that sparks curiosity, and at times, rejection. The strategy of many of these young people is silence. They study, work, adapt, without speaking too much about where they come from. Unlike other survivors who distance themselves from any form of reflection on trauma, Tova chooses a path that combines integration and processing. She studies psychology at Brooklyn College, then literature at City College of New York, and social work at Rutgers University. It is not a neutral path. For her, training as a therapist involves systematizing, with clinical tools, an experience that goes way back. Later, she taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and directed the Jewish Family Service of Somerset and Warren counties for over 20 years. She worked with migrant families, victims of violence, and people broken by various forms of loss. In each session, she acted not only as a professional, but also as someone who knows firsthand what it means for the world to collapse. For decades, the story of her childhood circulated in limited circles, talks at schools, synagogues, and universities. Her testimony appears in the book Kinderlager, published by Milton J. Neuvsma in Negentien achter Negentig, which collects the experiences of several child survivors of Auschwitz. Later, in 2022, she publishes her own memoir, The Daughter of Auschwitz, written alongside journalist Malcolm Brabant. There, she reconstructs, with a precision that blends personal memory and historical context, life in the ghetto, the transfer to Starachowitz, the deportation, the Kinderlager, the gas chamber, the liberation, and the long road toward a relatively stable life in the United States. The book not only adds details to academic historiography, it also offers younger generations an emotional entry point to the past. However, the great transformation of her public role comes only in the 2000s. In a context of increasing misinformation, relativization, and Holocaust denial, her grandson decides to open a TikTok account for her. From the living room of the family home in New Jersey, the young man films short videos in which Tova answers questions about life in Auschwitz, shows her tattoo, explains what she felt when she was 6 years old, and describes in simple terms scenes that in books usually appear wrapped in solemn language. What initially is a domestic project quickly becomes a global phenomenon. Millions of views, messages from all over the world, young people who, for the first time, hear the word Auschwitz not in a classroom, but on a screen of their phone. This presence on social media has several layers. For memory historians, it represents the shift from the era of witnesses to the digital era of memory, where the voices of survivors are recorded in formats that will continue circulating long after they are gone. For Tova, it is also a way of fulfilling what she sees as a moral obligation, to speak on behalf of 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered, whose names were never tattooed. She has said on more than one occasion, "Being a survivor means having a responsibility." This responsibility has also led her to high-visibility institutional speeches, such as her intervention at the International Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony in Auschwitz in 2025, and her invitation to address the German Bundestag in January 2026. The girl who hid among the corpses in Birkenau finds herself 80 years later speaking before the parliament of the country that designed that system of death. Today, Tova Friedman lives primarily as an elderly woman carrying an extraordinary biography. Married for 60 years, mother of 4 children, grandmother of 8 grandchildren, residing in New Jersey, concerned about contemporary politics and the future of her descendants. In recent interviews, she declares herself skeptical of many current leaders and fears that the world has not learned enough from the Shoah. But she also says that her Jewish faith and her family have given her a meaningful structure. Everyday life coexists with exceptional episodes, like the publication of her memoirs in multiple languages, or the feeling of speaking to young people on different continents from the screen of a phone. In her case, rebuilding her life did not mean forgetting or closing the story in a distant past, but precisely integrating it into her present. The number tattooed on her arm is still visible. She does not hide it. She shows it again and again because she knows that in a world saturated with images, that fragment of skin is one of the few pieces of evidence that can still directly address those who look at it. Every time she raises her arm before the camera or a group of students, the distance between the child from the kinderlager and the retired therapist shortens. Her old age is marked by a double movement. It is a time of physical fragility, but also of maximum public exposure. Behind the museum, Sam Harris, from the ghetto and the Częstochowa camp to Chicago. If today one enters the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center on the outskirts of Chicago, it's easy to see the building, the exhibitions, the school visits. What's harder to imagine is that part of all of this was born from the memory of a child who spent years hiding, hungry and terrified, in a ghetto and a labor camp in occupied Poland. That child was named Zlamek Rzeznik. Today the world knows him as Sam Harris. He was born in 1935 in Dęblin, a small Polish town on the banks of the Vistula River, in a large Orthodox Jewish family. He was the youngest of 7 siblings. His father was a sofer, a scribe of sacred texts, a respected figure in the community. Life in those first 4 years was spent between school, synagogue and childhood games, in an environment where Jewish identity was visible and everyday. That world disappeared abruptly when, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Soon after, the Dęblin ghetto was created. Sam, his parents and his 7 siblings were forced to move there along with thousands of other Jews. For almost 3 years, the ghetto became their closed universe. Hunger, overcrowding, disease and violence marked daily life. From a child's perspective, the ghetto is remembered as a place where the street was dangerous and raids could start at any moment. Games were interrupted by the shouts of soldiers, the noise of trucks and orders shouted while people were pushed around. School ceased to exist. Priorities shifted to finding a piece of bread and avoiding the guards. The liquidation of the ghetto in 1942 is one of the key moments in his life. One day, trucks filled with soldiers entered Dęblin. They ordered the Jews to gather in the market square. Those who didn't walk fast enough were beaten or killed on the spot. Sam, barely 7 years old, was in the deportation line with his father, holding his hand. He could only see legs, boots, and the movement of people toward the train cars. He heard gunshots, cries, and orders. In a gesture that would be repeated in many other Holocaust stories, Sam's father made an instant decision. He pushed him out of the line and whispered for him to run. Sam ran. No one seemed to notice. He managed to hide and found his sister Sarah behind some bricks. The two stayed there, watching as parents, siblings, and neighbors were taken to the train cars. That was the last time he saw his mother, father, and 5 of his siblings. Days later, he would learn, through rumors, that the fate of that convoy had been Treblinka, one of the deadliest extermination camps in Operation Reinhard. From a historical point of view, it's just another statistic in the genocide. From the perspective of a 7-year-old child, it's the origin of a void that will accompany him for the rest of his life. After the liquidation, the few who survived were relocated. His older sister Rosa was assigned as slave labor to a work camp near Dęblin. There, she became the main support for Sam and Sarah. She hid them whenever she could, keeping them out of sight during selections and roll calls, sneaking them among the adults so they appeared older than they were. The logic of the camp was brutal. Only work justified life. Young children were considered useless and therefore dispensable. For Sam, surviving meant learning how not to appear like a child. Daily life in that camp revolved around sirens, roll calls, forced labor, and constant hunger. The memories Sam holds are fragmented but revealing. Long lines in the rain or snow, guards beating anyone who moved, the fear of being singled out for punishment or deportation. The food consisted of watery soups and minimal rations of bread. They slept packed together and diseases spread easily. In that environment, the small protective net that Rosa wove around her siblings was almost their only defense. In 1944, as the military situation for the Reich began to deteriorate, Sam, Rosa, and Sarah were deported to the Częstochowa labor camp complex, where the German company Hague exploited thousands of prisoners in munitions factories. Again, Rosa managed to hide her siblings, this time in an even more industrialized setting. Częstochowa was not an extermination camp like Treblinka, but mortality from hunger, exhaustion, and disease was extremely high. The prisoners worked producing ammunition, with minimal protection and under constant threat. For Sam, the Częstochowa camp was the final stage of his childhood under Nazi rule. There he learned to move between machines, to find corners where the guards couldn't see him, and to distinguish by the tone of an officer's voice whether a blow or an order was coming. Violence was routine. Public executions reminded everyone of the price of breaking the camp's rules. The only strategy was to stay alive until the next day. The family structure was reduced to a survival triangle. Rosa as an almost maternal figure, Sarah as a companion in fear, and Sam as the youngest, protected at the cost of enormous risks. In January 1945, the Eastern Front approached Częstochowa. The Germans began evacuating some camps through death marches, but in this case the arrival of the Red Army was relatively fast. When the Soviets entered, Sam was 9 years old. There were no schools, no toys, no recognizable childhood rituals. He knew how to identify weapons, uniforms, and the types of noise boots made. He knew what it was like to see a corpse on the ground and keep walking to avoid being the next one. The liberation meant the immediate end of Nazi danger, but not the beginning of a stable life. 3 children were alone in a devastated country. After the war, Rosa de facto assumed the role of mother. During 1945 and 1946, they moved through various Allied-controlled areas amid millions of displaced people. Jewish communal structures were shattered. Many survivors didn't know if their families were still alive. For orphans, the alternatives were orphanages, forming kibbutzim or emigration. In 1946, Rosa made a crucial decision. She took Sam and Sarah out of Poland, secretly took them to Austria, and arranged for Jewish organizations to manage their transfer to the United States. In 1947, the 2 siblings arrived in New York. They were 12 and 14 years old. There, they were adopted by different families. Slamek became Sam Harris, the surname of the family that took him in, and moved to Chicago. With a simple name change, his life entered a new chapter. For him, the post-war period meant learning English, going to school, working as a teenager, and fitting into a society that knew little about the Holocaust. The past was encapsulated in nightmares and daytime silences. For years, Sam spoke almost nothing about what he had lived through. He became part of what many researchers call the generation of silence, survivors who, out of shame, guilt, pain, or simple adaptation instinct, pushed the past aside while building a new life. He studied, did military service, worked, married Didi, had children, and fully integrated into middle-class American life. Those who knew him saw a hard-working, sociable man involved in his community. Only those closer to him sensed that there was something unsaid. His wife has said that she could tell that the experience was eating him up inside, but that he refused to speak about it. The turning point came in 1981, when he traveled to Jerusalem to participate in the World Gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors. There, for the first time, he met thousands of people who shared similar stories: ghettos, camps, escapes, orphanhood. That meeting opened a floodgate. Sam realized that his silence, far from protecting him, had isolated him. He returned to the United States with a new conviction. He had to tell his story, first in small groups, then in schools, synagogues, and civic associations. The voice of the child from Dęblin began to find a space in the public sphere. Over time, his commitment to memory turned into a concrete project, the creation of a major Holocaust museum in Illinois. Sam was one of the driving forces behind the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, a 6,000-square-meter building in Skokie. It wasn't just about building walls and display cases, it was about designing a place where new generations could learn what had happened and why it mattered. For him, the museum was a structural response to the loss of his family. If he couldn't bring his parents and siblings back to life, at least he could contribute to ensuring that their deaths wouldn't be dissolved in oblivion. His role was not symbolic. He worked on fundraising, spoke with authorities, and got involved in educational design. Over the years, the museum became a landmark institution, and Sam became its emeritus president. There not only are objects and documents displayed, but his story is also heard in a singular format, an interactive experience in which a hologram of him answers questions from the public. Technology allows future visitors to continue speaking with him even when he can no longer do so in person. The voice of a child from the Dęblin ghetto, mediated by cameras and algorithms, is projected into decades to come. In addition to his institutional work, Sam decided to write. Together with Cheryl Gorder, he published Sammy, Child Survivor of the Holocaust, a book in which he recounts his childhood in the ghetto and in Częstochowa with accessible language aimed at young readers. Later, alongside his wife Didi, he wrote If Only My Belt Could Speak, where he uses an everyday object, the belt he carried with him for years, as a thread to discuss memory, identity, and resilience. The choice is not casual. In the absence of family graves, objects become material witnesses of what was lived. How does Sam Harris live today? He lives as a man over 80 who has traversed nearly the entire arc of the 20th and early 21st centuries, from a ghetto in Poland to the honorary presidency of a museum in the United States. He resides in the Chicago area, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community that recognizes him both for his personal warmth and his history. He participates in commemorative events, grants interviews, and receives groups of students. He often presents himself not only as a victim, but as a citizen concerned about current anti-Semitism, racism, and contemporary persecutions. He insists that the lesson of the Holocaust is not exclusive to Jews, but universal. Sam's daily life combines the routine of any elderly person with moments of high symbolic intensity: state ceremonies, honors like the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, meetings with community leaders. In all these instances, he returns again and again to the child he once was. He tells how his father pushed him out of the line, how his older sister risked her life hiding him, how he survived in a system designed to eliminate him. Each audience is different, but the message is the same. What saved Sam was not the kindness of the system, but individual decisions of resistance and solidarity. From the historian's perspective, his trajectory illustrates several common patterns among Holocaust child survivors. First, survival linked to a chain of adult decisions: the push from his father in the line to Treblinka, Rosa's bravery hiding him in 2 different camps, the international organizations that facilitated his emigration, the American family that adopted him. Second, a long period of silence in the post-war years, in which rebuilding life almost necessarily meant marginalizing the past. And finally, old age in which memory becomes a profession: speaking, writing, founding institutions, leaving one's own voice recorded. Born in an extermination camp, Eva Clarke and Life After Mauthausen. When we talk about Holocaust child survivors, we often imagine kids who were a few years old when the war broke out, who remember their home, school and neighborhood. In Eva Clarke's case, the story is even more extreme. She was born directly in a concentration camp on a cart at the entrance of one of the most brutal death sites in the Nazi system. For decades, her existence was living proof that even in the final moments when the Reich was crumbling, the machinery of extermination continued to function. Today, as an elderly woman, she lives in England and has turned this improbable story into a tool for education and a warning against hatred. Eva's life begins before her birth with the story of her parents. Her mother, Anka Bergman, was born in 1917 into a Jewish family in Trajectories, in what was then Czechoslovakia. She studied law in Prague until the anti-Semitic laws shut the doors of the university to her. Her father, Bernd Nathan, was a German Jewish architect who had moved to Prague to escape Nazism. They married in 1940, already under German occupation. The couple was deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto camp in December 1941, a place presented by Nazi propaganda as a model colony, but which actually served as a prelude to Auschwitz and other camps. In Theresienstadt, Anka and Bernd tried to maintain some semblance of a shared life. Their first child, Dan, also called George, was born in early 1944. The baby died of pneumonia at 2 months old, due to overcrowding, hunger and lack of medical attention. For historians, Dan is one of the many children of Theresienstadt who never appeared in deportation statistics because they died inside the ghetto itself. For Anka, he was the first irreparable loss. In September 1944, Bernd was deported to Auschwitz. He never knew that his wife was pregnant again. He was killed there on January 18, 1945, just days before the camp's liberation. The records indicate that he was shot in one of the last mass executions of prisoners as the Nazis tried to erase evidence and evacuate the camp. Anka was left alone, without a husband, without her first child, pregnant in a system that considered pregnant women and babies as useless mouths that should be eliminated upon arrival. At the end of 1944, she was herself deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. On the selection ramp, an SS doctor asked her if she was pregnant. Anka knew that admitting it was a death sentence. She lied and said no. That lie saved her life and is the first direct link in the chain that would allow Eva to be born. After a few weeks in Auschwitz, Anka was sent to a subcamp in Freiburg, where she worked as a slave laborer in a munitions factory for 6 months. She continued hiding her pregnancy, wearing loose clothing, trying not to attract attention during roll calls. Her weight dropped to below 35 kilograms. In late March and early April of 1945, with the Soviet front advancing, the Nazi authorities decided to evacuate that subcamp. Anka, along with other prisoners, was crammed into open coal wagons. The journey lasted about 17 days, with almost no food or water, traveling through a bombed-out, chaotic Germany. Many women died during the trip. Their bodies were thrown from the wagons. The train was heading to Mauthausen, a Grade 3 camp reserved for prisoners considered irrecoverable. As the train neared the station, Anka saw the name Mauthausen painted on a sign. She recognized it. She knew from rumors that it was a place from which almost no one left alive. The shock caused her to go into labor. They took her off the wagon and placed her on a cart between the station and the entrance to the camp. There, with no medical assistance, no hygiene, surrounded by exhausted prisoners and armed guards, she gave birth. On April 29, 1945, Eva Olga Nathanova was born, who would later be called Eva Clarke. She weighed about 1.5 kilograms. Her mother was skin and bones, weighing 35 kilograms. It was, literally, a birth on the edge of death. Eva often summarizes her survival with 3 reasons her mother mentioned. First, a chilling fact. On April 28th, the Nazis had run out of gas for the Mauthausen gas chamber. If the train had arrived a few days earlier, they would probably have been sent directly to death. Second, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin, accelerating the collapse of the command structure. And third, on May 5th, the 11th Armored Division of the United States liberated the camp. Between April 29th and May 5th, Anka and her baby clung to life in extreme conditions, nourished with minimal milk substitutes. A cameraman from the Army Signal Corps filmed the mother and newborn, images that decades later would serve as visual proof of that improbable story. The liberation did not mean an immediate happy ending. Mauthausen was, according to Allied reports, a landscape of corpses, the sick, and people on the brink of death. Anke and her baby were transferred to makeshift hospitals. The very idea of childhood did not exist yet for Eva. Her first days were spent between barracks and makeshift medical rooms. When they were strong enough, they returned to Prague, where they stayed with a cousin who had survived. There, Anke had to fully process the magnitude of her loss. Her husband, her parents, and her two sisters had been murdered in Auschwitz. The baby she held in her arms was the only living remnant of a large family destroyed. In February 1948, in a Czechoslovakia that had just fallen under communist control, Anke married Karel Bergman, a Czech Jew who had escaped to the United Kingdom in 1939, enlisted as an interpreter in the Royal Air Force, and had also lost his family in the Shoah. They shared language, origin, and trauma. Later, Karel legally adopted Eva, and she took the surname Bergman. That same year, the family left the country for the West. Their initial plan was to emigrate to Canada, but a job for Karel in Wales changed their destination. They settled in Cardiff, where the normal life of a girl born in a camp would begin. Eva's childhood in Wales was, in many ways, the childhood of any child of immigrants. She attended local schools, learned English with a Welsh accent, and played in neighborhoods where almost no one knew she had been a baby of the camp. The Shoah was present in the house, but it didn't dominate every conversation. Anke, like many survivor mothers, balanced the protection of her daughter with not lying to her. One specific episode marked Eva's awareness. One day, returning from school, she saw that her mother's handbag had the initials AN. Her last name was Bergman, so she asked why the bag didn't have AB. Anke then explained carefully that her maiden name was Nathanova, that she had been married to a man named Bernd Nathan, and that this man, her biological father, had been killed in Auschwitz. She also told her that she had had an older brother, Dan, who died as a baby in Theresienstadt. According to Eva, this gesture of honesty gave her a solid foundation. She knew who she was, where she came from, and what had been lost. The identity of being born in Mauthausen was, for many years, an intimate detail, not a public one. Eva grew up, passed exams, moved to Cambridge, married Malcolm Clark, and had 2 children. She worked for 20 years as an administrator at a higher education college, Cambridge Regional College. In her professional life, she was an efficient official. In her family life, a mother who, like many second-generation refugees, mixed humor, demands, and the weight of a past history. Only in small circles did she sometimes mention that she had been born in a concentration camp. One striking detail of her biography connects, almost ironically, the aerial front of the war with her family history. Her husband's father, Kenneth Clark, had been a bomber navigator in the RAF and participated in the bombing of Dresden in February 1945, while Anke was hidden with other prisoners near the city during her passage through various camps. This is an example of how the paths of victims and participants in the Allied war effort intersect decades later, when war narratives become complex family stories. Eva's major public turning point came around the year 2000. Until then, she had spoken little in public about the Holocaust. The death of her stepfather Karel, the aging of her mother, and the growing educational interest in the Shoah in the UK created a new context. Eva was invited by the Holocaust Educational Trust to testify in schools and memorial events. She discovered that combining her own voice with Anke's history had an enormous impact on teenagers who, in many cases, had never heard in detail about camps like Mauthausen. She left her administrative job and almost entirely dedicated herself to Holocaust education. Since then, she has spoken in hundreds of schools, universities, military bases, and public institutions. She has traveled with groups of British students to Poland and Austria, guiding them through places like Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen, and recounting on site the history of her parents and her own birth. She has participated in official ceremonies, such as anniversaries of the liberation of Mauthausen, organized by the Austrian government, and in memory projects where her testimony is recorded on video for future use. Her story is also part of the work Born Survivors by author Wendy Holden, which tells the lives of 3 young pregnant women in the Nazi camp system and the babies who managed to survive. The book gained wide circulation and positioned Eva, along with the other 2 daughters of the protagonists, as a symbol of a very specific category: children born in the Holocaust. a tiny minority representing the extreme opposite of the Nazi policy of annihilating Jewish life. Institutional recognition for her work came with time. In 2015, she received an honorary doctorate in law from De Montfort University for her contribution to Holocaust education. In 2019, she was awarded the British Empire Medal in the New Year Honours List, along with 3 other survivors, for services to Holocaust education. In 2023, the Blaenau-Gwent district in Wales granted her the Freedom of the County, a symbolic honour that emphasises the link between her personal history and the community where she grew up. Unlike Tova Friedman or Sam Harris, who emigrated as children to the United States, Eva considers herself both British and Czech. She lives in Cambridge, has children and grandchildren, and maintains a busy schedule that for someone of her age would be exhausting: talks, interviews, and memorial trips. In her daily life, she balances household and family tasks with reviewing emails from schools requesting her presence, preparing speeches for Holocaust Memorial Day, and reading news where she, with concern, sees the persistence of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in Europe. In her testimonies, she insists on 2 key ideas. The first is that her story is largely the story of her mother. Without Anka's physical and mental strength, she wouldn't exist. That's why she often presents herself not just as a survivor, but as the daughter of a survivor, emphasizing the role of the previous generation. The second is that the lesson of the Holocaust is not limited to the past. Time and again, she connects the racial hatred that led to the Shoah with contemporary forms of dehumanization, whether against refugees, ethnic minorities, or any group turned into a scapegoat. She doesn't just tell what happened, but asks what is being done today with that knowledge. In her case, childhood has no personal memories of the camps, but her biography is absolutely shaped by that circumstance. Her birthplace, Mauthausen, appears on her certificate, in documentaries and in reports. The post-war years offered her a normal childhood in the UK, but that normalcy was framed by the mourning of a mother who had lost nearly all her family and by a community environment of refugees. Adulthood brought her a stable profession and her own family, but also the responsibility of speaking on behalf of those who could not. For her, rebuilding life meant constructing a full existence without denying the origin in a place of death. Unlike many survivors who chose almost complete silence, Eva embraced from a certain age that her main public task was to tell that story over and over again, especially to young people who are several generations removed from the events. Her old age is marked by recognition and exposure, but also by the logical fatigue of someone who has repeated her testimony hundreds of times. When she speaks today, it is understood that she is not only speaking for herself, she speaks for her murdered father, for her brother who died in Theresienstadt, for the babies who never made it out of other trains. Emmie Arbel, a childhood among fields and an old age among memories. She was born in 1937 in The Hague, in an integrated, peaceful, middle-class Jewish family. Her parents, Julia and Jacob, had built a normal life in the Netherlands. 3 children, grandparents living just a few meters away, a large Jewish community, schools, shops, a rhythm of European city life that seemed stable. This normality is important to keep in mind, because everything that follows is a break from something that, until then, was perceived as safe. When Germany invades the Netherlands in May 1940, the first anti-Jewish measures are not yet seen as a death sentence, but as a progressive degradation of rights. Labor restrictions, curfews, bans on certain spaces, the obligation to wear the yellow star. For a 4-year-old girl, these changes are not understood as political concepts. They are translated into looks, whispers, and the feeling that being who you are has become dangerous. On November 10, 1942, the fiction of daily life is completely shattered. The Dutch police, subordinate to the SS, break into the family home. These are not unknown soldiers from a distant front, they are uniformed men who speak the language of the neighborhood. The family is arrested and sent to the Westerbork transit camp, the intermediate place between civilian life and the deportation machinery to the east. There, for over a year, the girl learns that the world can be reduced to barracks, lists and trains. Westerbork is not an extermination camp, but it is the logistical prelude to Auschwitz and Sobibor. Weekly convoys depart from its platforms. The adults know that every list could be the last. For a child, what remains is a constant atmosphere of anxiety that permeates even the normal moments: food, play, nights. In later testimonies, Emmie recalls fewer concrete scenes and more emotions: fear, confusion, the blurred perception that something inevitable is happening to her family. In February 1944, the deportation network tightens. The father is sent to Buchenwald and then to a subcamp for forced labor, where he will die that same year. The mother and 3 children are separated from the grandparents, who are sent to Auschwitz and killed shortly thereafter. For a 7-year-old girl, death is not formulated as ideological murder, but as disappearance without return. Suddenly, people who were always there are no longer there, and no one offers an explanation she can understand. The next stage is the Ravensbrück women's camp. There, the mother and children enter a universe where violence is systematic, planned, but also arbitrary. The girl is too young to understand the structure of the camp, the hierarchies between SS officers, kapos, and prisoners. What she registers are smells, screams, cold, hunger, and the feeling of being trapped in a space where there is no refuge. Later, she will say that many memories from that time are disjointed images, almost frames without continuity, and blacked out areas where memory simply does not enter. At the beginning of 1945, when the Nazi system begins to crumble, the family is transferred to Bergen-Belsen. If Ravensbrück was the place of brutal discipline, Bergen-Belsen is the place of total collapse: extreme overcrowding, disease, unburied bodies, terminal hunger. The girl moves between exhausted bodies. She sees her mother struggling to find any scraps of food. She learns to identify the sound of the coughs of the dying. Later, investigators will speak of a humanitarian catastrophe. In the mind of a child, it is the confirmation that the world can become a place where death is the norm and life the exception. When British troops liberate the camp in April 1945, the girl is 7 or 8 years old. Officially, the war ends for her. In practice, another form of survival begins. The mother, devastated by hunger and disease, dies shortly after the liberation. The father and the grandparents have already been killed. The girl leaves the camp as a survivor, but also as an orphan, malnourished, with a history that no one knows exactly how to listen to. As with many other children liberated from the camps, she is sent to Sweden for recovery. In Malmö, she spends months receiving food, medical care, and some material stability. But physical health does not repair the emotional rupture. In later interviews, she will say that even there she felt that the world was fragile, provisional, that everything could collapse again. Her identity is fragmented. She is too young to articulate a coherent narrative, but too old to forget. With the help of the Red Cross lists, her older brother locates her name in Sweden and manages to bring her back to the Netherlands. There, they enter a foster family that takes in orphaned Jewish children. On paper, it is a story of rescue. In the girl's actual experience, it becomes another phase of violence and abuse. In the foster home, she falls ill with tuberculosis and spends almost an entire year in bed, isolated, vulnerable. She suffers sexual abuse from the adoptive father. It is not just the trauma from the camps, it is the devastating message that even those who should protect her can harm her. Red Cross. This detail is crucial for understanding how many survivors live today. The horror does not end with liberation. It recycles into new forms of vulnerability, often invisible to the official narrative. In the post-war period, Europe wants to rebuild, to look forward. The children returning from the camps are sometimes seen as lucky, but many, like Emmie, carry a double burden: the Nazi trauma and the wounds inflicted afterward by adults who either could not or would not care for them. At 9.5 years old, the girl enters a Montessori school for the first time. It is a turning point. There she finds an environment where her curiosity is valued, where she can learn at her own pace, where she is not just the girl from the camp, but a student with her own name. Education, in this context, is not just the transmission of knowledge. It is a space for rebuilding self-esteem. For the first time, someone shows her that she can make decisions, explore, and make mistakes without being brutally punished. Montessori school. In 1949, the adoptive family will emigrate to Israel. For many survivors, the creation of the Jewish state represents the promise of a permanent home. For Emmie, the reality is more ambivalent. They are first housed in an old British military camp and later in a kibbutz. On paper, it is a supportive, egalitarian community where everyone shares work and resources. In practice, for a young person marked by trauma, it is also a place where others once again decide for her. Schedules, tasks, even intimate aspects of life are regulated. The underlying message, once again, is that her body and her time belong to others, Israel. Over time, she decides to leave the kibbutz and move to Haifa. It is a small gesture when seen from the outside. From the inside, it is a radical act of self-determination. After years in camps, orphanages, foster families, and communities where someone else is always in charge, she changes her environment by her own choice. She chooses a city, a job, a path. Slowly, and not without setbacks, she begins to build an adult life. She works in a psychiatric clinic, first as a secretary, and then as an administrative manager. She marries, has 3 daughters, and forms a family that is not defined solely by what was done to her, but by what she decides to do. Here, another common trait appears among many surviving children who are now elderly: the ability to function for decades without the environment knowing the depth of the trauma. Emmie works, raises her daughters, pays bills, stands in line at the supermarket. From the outside, she is just another Israeli citizen. Inside, memories are activated unpredictably. The smell of smoke, a train, a uniform, a word in German can trigger flashbacks that send her back to Ravensbrück or Bergen-Belsen. For a long time, she does not speak about it, neither with colleagues nor with neighbors, and sometimes not even with her own family. In old age, however, she makes a shift. Starting in 2012, she agrees to become a public witness. She begins to travel regularly to Germany, especially to the former site of the Ravensbrück camp, to speak with students, teachers, and youth groups. She does not do this from the comfort of a conquered story, but from the awareness that these experiences are still alive in her body. She insists that she does not want compassion. What she seeks is understanding and responsibility. Ravensbrück Memorial. Her role as a witness is not limited to traditional lectures. She participates in artistic education projects such as Sound in the Silence, which combines theatre, music, and memory in historical spaces linked to Nazism. There, young Europeans engage in dialogue with survivors and transform those stories into works that they themselves perform. For Emmie, these projects offer something that academic reports cannot: a way to share emotions without reducing them to data. For the students, they offer direct contact with someone who is not a figure from a history book, but a person who still wonders what it means to live after all of that. Sound in the Silence. At the same time, she becomes involved in an unusual project. She allows an artist to turn her life into a graphic novel. The German illustrator Barbara Yellin spends years interviewing her, reviewing archives, cross-checking documents. The result is neither a hagiography nor a dramatic pamphlet, but a visual exploration of what it means to remember, and above all, what it means not to be able to remember fully. Pages where the lines are interrupted or turn black show silences that even words cannot fill. This work, which combines her childhood in The Hague, the camps, post-war Europe, immigration to Israel, and old age as a witness, has a curious effect. It gives Emmie back her own story, organized and visible. Many survivors have said something similar when publishing memoirs or participating in documentaries. For the first time, they see their life as a sequence, not just disconnected fragments. In Emmie's case, moreover, the comic format allows teenagers who have never set foot in Europe or heard of Ravensbrück to approach her experience without the barrier of academic text. To this day, she lives near Haifa, retired from her administrative work, with daughters and grandchildren, surrounded by everyday objects that do not reveal the intensity of what she has lived through. She has public recognition, awards, invitations, travels, but her daily life is not a permanent ceremony. There are shopping trips, medical appointments, family conversations, and small domestic problems. The difference is that in her case, every airplane noise, every news story about anti-Semitism, every image of war on television is connected to a personal experience of persecution that never quite disappears. At the same time, she has developed a simple, tough philosophy. It is not about overcoming the past, but learning to live with it. There is no closure, no final point. There are, however, concrete decisions. Speaking at schools even though it is difficult, agreeing to be portrayed in a graphic novel even though it exposes her, traveling to Germany again and again despite the landscape itself triggering memories. Her old age is not just that of a surviving victim, it is that of a woman who has turned her biography into a pedagogical tool, knowing that this task does not heal her wounds, but it can help prevent them from being repeated. In 2023, when a new wave of violence erupts in the Middle East, she finds herself precisely in a former Nazi camp headquarters, acting as a witness. In a message to her collaborator, she writes that paradoxically, she feels safer in that place filled with memory than in her own country. The sentence encapsulates nearly a century of history. A Jewish woman, a survivor of Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, who feels protected inside a former Nazi prison, turned into a memorial, while outside the walls, the world is once again shaken by hatred and war. 70072. Lydia Maximovic, the child of Mengele, who chose not to hate. On May 26, 2021, in the San Damaso courtyard of the Vatican, an elderly woman rolled up her sleeve in front of Pope Francis. A number appeared on her left forearm, 70072. The Pope looked at it in silence, leaned down and kissed it. Her name is Lydia Maximovic, deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau before she was 3 years old, used as a human guinea pig by Josef Mengele. That number accompanied her throughout her life. That gesture encapsulated her biography, the body of an older woman, the mark of a young prisoner, and the attempt to transform that memory into something that speaks of dignity, not revenge. Lydia was not born in Poland, but in Belarus, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. Her birth name was Ludmila Boksarowa, born in December 1940 near Nowy Sambor, and raised with her parents, Anna and Alexei, in the small village of Przybitki near Polotsk. It was a rural environment, with grandparents, animals, a life that, from the perspective of history, we could call ordinary. That normality didn't last long. The family was accused of having contacts with partisans and arrested. They spent several weeks in prison in Vitebsk, alongside other peasants and entire families. For a 2-year-old girl, it meant bars, cold, and an early sense of danger. One day the prisoners were led to a station and shoved into cattle cars, closed doors, sub-zero temperatures, no bathrooms, almost no food or water. The train travelled for days to an unknown destination. When it finally stopped, the first thing Lydia saw when the doors opened were armed men in dark uniforms, barking dogs, and searchlights cutting through the night. It was December 4th, 1943. The family had arrived at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. The selection on the ramp was immediate, shouting in German, separate queues, adults trying not to lose sight of their children. Lydia remembers the scene mostly as noise and fear. Her grandparents, elderly, were sent directly to the gas chambers, along with the elderly, the sick, and those deemed unfit for work. It was the last time she saw them. Her mother, Anna, passed the selection and was sent to forced labor. The child was kept with her for the moment, within the group of women and children destined for quarantine. In the quarantine barracks, they take away their clothes, give them striped uniforms and shave their heads. Then comes the tattooing, both adults and children. Anna is branded with the number 70071, her daughter with the number 70072. The number replaces the name. In the logic of the camp, that tattoo was a tool of dehumanization. In the logic of memory, it would later become a permanent document, impossible to lose or falsify. Soon, mother and daughter are separated. Anna goes to a labor barrack, Lydia to the children's barrack. That building serves as a dormitory, a waiting room, and a laboratory for Josef Mengele's experiments. Children from all over occupied Europe are mixed together. The everyday language is a slang made up of bits of Polish, German, Hungarian, Yiddish, and Russian. The basic rule the child learns is simple and brutal. Don't talk too much, don't play, don't draw attention. Hunger, cold, lice, and longing for her mother form the permanent backdrop. It is in this barrack where Mengele appears. Lydia will always remember him for his impeccably polished boots and for a gaze she describes as possessed. For the children, his presence means terror. He enters, reads tattooed numbers, and points to those who will be taken to the camp's hospital. There, Lydia and other children undergo mass blood extractions, injections of saline substances, and other procedures without anesthesia, without explanation. After one of those medical visits, the little girl no longer recognizes even her own mother. Her body is covered in sores. She is pale and weak, and she has vision problems. From a medical standpoint, they were pseudo-scientific experiments. From the child's perspective, they were sessions of absolute pain, surrounded by a cold ritual of white coats, instruments, and orders. For years, Lydia would think that she was chosen for these experiments because she wasn't a good girl, because she deserved punishment. It is one of the most common psychological consequences among Holocaust children, internalizing guilt for what the adults did. In the final months of the war, the situation in Auschwitz changes. The Nazis begin evacuating the camp, organizing death marches into the interior of the Reich and destroying evidence. Anna is included in one of these columns and sent to Ravensbrück and then to Bergen-Belsen. Lydia, on the other hand, stays in Birkenau with the group of children she was part of. Once again, a decision made by others would years later become a dividing line between life and death. On January 27, 1945, the Red Army enters Auschwitz. They find barracks filled with sick people, corpses and malnourished children. Among them is Lydia, aged 5, with a tattoo on her arm, physical consequences from the experiments, and no family in sight. In the following days, residents of Oświęcim and nearby villages come to the camp to help, bring food and offer homes. A Polish couple, Bronisława and Ryszard Rydzikowski, notice the girl and decide to take her home. 3 years later, they formally adopt her. Lydia's name changes to Lidia Rydzikowska. In this new home, she sees for the first time something that didn't exist in the camp: a bed with sheets, a kitchen, a table with plates. She learns Catholic prayers, attends Mass, and integrates into a Polish family that surrounds her with affection. They believe her biological mother has died, and they convey this to her. Lydia grows up believing she is an orphan. The tattoo on her arm becomes a problem. At school, on the street, in the summer when her arms are exposed. She often hides it with bandages or long clothing. For years she feels worse than the others, that there is something about her that separates her from everyone else. A detail from her childhood games reveals how deeply the camp had imprinted on her. In the backyard of the house with other children, she sometimes played concentration. She would give orders in broken German, organize counts, choose who went with the doctor and who stayed in the barracks. It wasn't a conscious recreation of the horror, but rather the way her child's mind tried to domesticate an experience she didn't fully understand. In her adolescence, this past remains a silent but active background. Lydia continues her studies, gets a job at a design office in Poland, and tries to live a life as normal as her memories and the post-war political context allow. For a long time, she doesn't speak publicly about Auschwitz or Mengele. Like many survivors, she chooses silence as a strategy for psychological survival. However, at the age of 19, the need to know more becomes overwhelming. She begins to investigate whether her mother really died. Through contacts and Soviet archives, she discovers something unexpected. Anna survived the death march, Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, and had been searching for her. In 1962, the two are reunited in Moscow. When the mother sees her, she faints. The Soviet press presents the reunion as the return of a girl liberated from Auschwitz by the Red Army. For Lydia, it is something more intimate, living proof that the initial bond wasn't completely destroyed, even though decades have passed. After this reunion, the Soviet authorities offer her the chance to study in the USSR, settle there, and rebuild her life in the country of her origin. Lydia chooses a different path. She returns to Poland. There, she has her adoptive family, her everyday language, and her new name. She forms her own family, works for many years in an engineering project office, and integrates into civilian life in post-war Poland. The girl from Birkenau becomes an employee, wife, mother, and later grandmother and great-grandmother. For decades, her story circulated in limited spaces. Starting in the 1990s and 2000s, with the growth of memory initiatives in Poland and Italy, her testimony gained a new visibility. Lydia collaborates with the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, participating in meetings with young people from many countries. She becomes one of the protagonists in the book L'infanzia rubata. I bambini liberati ad Auschwitz, The Stolen Childhood, The Children Liberated at Auschwitz, by researcher Helena Kubica, focused on the children liberated from the camp. In these activities, what she offers is not an academic lecture, but a direct conversation. She tells of the train, the number, Mengele's boots, the hunger, and then the Rydzikowski home, the school and adult life. In Italy, her figure becomes particularly well known. She frequently travels, invited by associations like La Memoria Viva, participates in school meetings, pilgrimages to Auschwitz, and commemoration events. Her life inspires a documentary, 70,072, La Niña que no sabía odiar, 70,072, The Girl Who Couldn't Hate, which traces her story from Belarus-Birkenau to contemporary Poland, with commentary from other survivors such as Samuel Modiano and Liliana Segre. Her biography La bambina che non sapeva odiare, The Girl Who Couldn't Hate, written alongside journalist Paolo Rodari, is also published, with a foreword by Pope Francis. In Italian, the title emphasizes something she often repeats, that despite everything she couldn't or didn't want to let herself be trapped by hate. The encounter with the Pope in 2021 was not an isolated episode, but the most visible point of her trajectory as a witness. That day, after the kiss on the tattoo, Lydia handed him 3 gifts: a candle, a painting of her as a child with her mother in front of the Birkenau entrance, and a rosary from St. John Paul II, which she uses every day to pray. She would later say that the Pope's gesture reconciled her with the world and gave her strength. Today, Lydia lives in Krakow. She is over 80, with children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Her routine resembles that of many elderly people: doctor visits, shopping, family gatherings, Sunday masses. But this normality coexists with a busy schedule of meetings with young people, especially in Poland and Italy. She travels to schools, memorials, and conferences. She shows them the number on her arm, talks about the 200,000 children killed in Auschwitz, warns them about anti-Semitism, extremism, and the populisms that are once again gaining ground. She often quotes a personal experience. For many years, she covered the number 70,072 with a bandage, feeling embarrassed. Today, she shows it with the awareness that it is a tool for education. In recent interviews, she has said that, thanks to what she lived through, she knows how to face extreme situations. Not because suffering is a desirable school, but because she learned as a child that even in the most hostile environments, there are decisions that can tilt the balance toward life. She also states that she is convinced she survived due to the intervention of a higher force, and that precisely for that reason she feels a duty to speak for those who could not. Her mission, she says, is to be the voice of the children who didn't make it out alive from Mengeles barracks. From the historian's perspective, Lydia's life illustrates several constants of Holocaust child survivors today. First, the identity rupture. She was born Soviet, grew up as a Catholic Polish child, and later discovered she was the daughter of a surviving Jewish mother. For a long time, she didn't know where she was from. Second, the prolongation of trauma beyond 1945. Liberation did not close the wound, it only changed the way it hurt. Third, the transition from silence to speech. Decades of normal life preceded the moment when she decided to tell her story over and over again, to generations who weren't born when she was in Birkenau. Today, Lydia Maximovic lives in balance between 2 dimensions. In one, she is an elderly woman who gets emotional with her grandchildren, gets tired climbing stairs, cooks, prays her rosary, and appreciates the affection from her adoptive family and the network of friends she has built in Poland and Italy. In the other, she is still the girl under 3 years old, marked with 70,072 Mengeles patient, the provisional orphan who arrived in Krakow from a liberated camp. Every time she rolls up her sleeve to show her arm, she brings together those 2 lives, the stolen past and the rebuilt present.